The Middle East changed overnight. In the early hours of a Saturday morning, the skies above Israel lit up with something the world had not witnessed in modern history: a direct, state-sponsored military assault launched from Iranian soil onto Israeli territory. Not a proxy strike, not a shadowy operation deniable by Tehran. A declared, coordinated, massive attack. Over 300 drones and ballistic missiles were fired in a single wave. The Iron Dome screamed to life. Fighter jets from multiple nations scrambled, and for a few suspended hours, the world held its breath, waiting to see whether the Middle East was about to descend into a war that could pull in every major power on the planet. This was not a miscalculation. This was not a rogue operation. This was Iran, the Islamic Republic, a nation of 90 million people, the most significant military power in the Persian Gulf, making a deliberate choice to cross a line it had carefully avoided for over 4 decades. For 40 years, Iran has fought its enemies through intermediaries: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, the militias spread across Iraq and Syria. Tehran has always maintained what strategists call plausible deniability, the ability to inflict damage while pointing elsewhere. That doctrine died on the night of April 13th, 2024. Iran stepped out from behind the curtain and fired directly. The immediate trigger was an Israeli airstrike on April 1st that destroyed the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria, killing 7 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officers, including 2 generals. Tehran called it an attack on Iranian sovereign territory. Israel neither confirmed nor denied responsibility, as it rarely does. But the message was clear, and so was Iran's response. This would not go unanswered. What followed was the largest drone and missile barrage ever launched at Israel in its history. More than 170 explosive drones, over 30 cruise missiles, more than 120 ballistic missiles, fired across a distance of over 1,500 kilometers with a flight time long enough for Israel, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Jordan to coordinate an extraordinary multinational interception effort. Israeli and American officials would later report that approximately 99% of the projectiles were intercepted before reaching their targets. Minor damage was recorded at the Nevatim Air Base in southern Israel. 1 Israeli child was critically injured. By the metrics of physical destruction, Iran failed. By the metrics of political symbolism, something irreversible had happened. A threshold had been crossed. A precedent had been set. And the question that every government, every intelligence agency, and every military planner on earth was asking in the hours that followed was the same: what happens next? That is exactly what this documentary is going to answer. We are going to walk through the full timeline: how the world arrived at this moment, what the attack revealed about Iranian military capability, what Israel's response options look like, what the major powers are signaling behind closed doors, and what this escalation means for global stability, energy markets, and your daily life. If you want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and where it is going, stay with us. And if you want to be the first to know when our next geopolitical analysis drops, subscribe now, because this story is far from over. To understand why Iran fired on Israel in April 2024, you have to go back much further than April 2024. You have to go back to 1979, when the Islamic Revolution swept Ayatollah Khomeini into power and toppled the Shah of Iran. One of the revolution's foundational ideological commitments was the destruction of the State of Israel. Not containment, not negotiation, elimination. The Islamic Republic enshrined anti-Zionism not merely as a foreign policy position, but as a religious and revolutionary duty. For the clerical leadership in Tehran, Israel's existence on land they considered Islamic was an affront that demanded a permanent response. But ideology collided with reality. Iran in 1979 was a nation in upheaval. Then came the Iran-Iraq War, which consumed nearly a decade and nearly 1 million lives. Direct military confrontation with Israel, a nuclear-armed state backed by the most powerful military in the world, was never a viable option. So Tehran built a different kind of war machine: patient, decentralized, deniable. Over the following decades, Iran constructed what military analysts call the axis of resistance, a network of armed proxy groups positioned across the region like pieces on a strategic chessboard. Hezbollah in southern Lebanon became the crown jewel of this network, receiving billions of dollars in Iranian funding, training, and weaponry, eventually amassing a missile arsenal larger than most standing armies. Hamas in Gaza became a second front, the Houthis in Yemen a third. Shia militias in Iraq and Syria completed the encirclement, a ring of Iranian-backed armed groups surrounding Israel from multiple directions. This was Iran's strategic doctrine: bleed Israel and its allies slowly, maintain deniability, and avoid triggering a direct confrontation that Iran could not survive. That doctrine held until it didn't. The fracture lines began to show in October 2023 when Hamas launched its devastating assault on southern Israel on October 7th, killing approximately 1,200 Israelis and taking around 250 hostages. It triggered a full-scale Israeli military campaign in Gaza. Hezbollah began exchanging fire with Israeli forces along the Lebanese border almost immediately. The Houthis started targeting commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq launched drone attacks against American bases. The entire axis of resistance activated simultaneously, and the pressure on Iran to demonstrate leadership within that network began to build. Then came April 1st, 2024. An Israeli airstrike destroyed the Iranian consulate building in the Medzeh district of Damascus, a structure that Iran and international law consider sovereign Iranian territory. 7 IRGC officers died in the strike, among them Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, one of the most senior Quds Force commanders in the region, responsible for coordinating Iranian military operations across Syria and Lebanon. For Tehran, this was categorically different from previous Israeli strikes on Iranian assets in Syria, of which there had been hundreds over the years. Those strikes had been absorbed, responded to indirectly, and filed away. But the consulate strike was a direct assault on what Iran declared to be Iranian soil. To absorb it in silence would be to signal weakness to every actor in the region watching closely, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the militias, to Saudi Arabia, to Washington, and above all, to the Iranian population at home. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, had a choice: respond through proxies as always and accept that the new Israeli doctrine of striking Iranian officers directly would continue unchallenged, or respond in a way that made clear there was a cost, a real, visible, state-level cost, to killing Iranian generals on what Tehran called Iranian ground. He chose to respond directly. The 13 days between April 1st and April 13th were not silence. They were preparation. Iranian military planners coordinated launch positions across multiple fronts: Iranian soil, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. The operation was designed to overwhelm Israeli air defenses through sheer volume and directional complexity, and on the night of April 13th, the order was given. The world that existed before that night was a world where Iran and Israel fought a shadow war. The world that emerged on April 14th was something different and considerably more dangerous. At approximately 11 p.m. local time on April 13th, 2024, Iran launched the largest direct military assault on Israel in the history of the conflict between the two nations. What unfolded over the next several hours was not a single strike. It was a layered, multi-vector, multi-platform operation executed simultaneously from at least 4 separate geographic locations: Iran itself, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. Understanding the mechanics of what happened that night matters enormously because the architecture of the attack tells us far more about Iranian intentions and capabilities than the headline numbers alone. The assault began with the drones. Shahed 136 loitering munitions, slow-moving, propeller-driven, and relatively inexpensive, and were launched in large numbers. These are the same drones Iran supplied to Russia for use against Ukrainian infrastructure. They are not precision weapons. They are attrition weapons, designed to exhaust air defense systems, drain interceptor missile stockpiles, and force defensive networks to make difficult triage decisions about which threats to prioritize. Their flight time from Iranian territory to Israeli airspace was estimated at several hours, long enough for the entire interception coalition to assemble and prepare. Then came the cruise missiles, faster, more maneuverable, and capable of flying at low altitudes to evade radar. Cruise missiles represent a significantly more sophisticated threat than drones. They require more capable interceptor systems and impose greater strain on integrated air defense networks. Iran fired over 30 of them. Finally, the ballistic missiles. These are the weapons that air defense planners fear most. Ballistic missiles travel at hypersonic speeds during their terminal descent phase, giving defensive systems only seconds to calculate intercept trajectories and fire. Iran launched more than 120 of them, a number that would have been catastrophic against almost any other nation's air defense architecture. Israel's version of events is well documented and largely corroborated by its coalition partners. The Israeli Defense Forces reported that approximately 99% of all projectiles were intercepted before reaching Israeli territory. American destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean fired dozens of interceptor missiles. British Royal Air Force jets operating from Cyprus shot down drones over the region. Jordanian air defenses engaged targets crossing their airspace, a remarkable public acknowledgement from Amman given the domestic political sensitivity of cooperating with Israel. French naval assets contributed to the defensive effort. The combined interception operation was, by any military standard, an extraordinary logistical and tactical achievement. The physical damage to Israel was limited. The Nevatim air base in the Negev desert sustained minor damage from at least one ballistic missile that penetrated the defensive screen. A 7-year-old Bedouin girl named Amina al-Hudur was critically wounded by shrapnel in her home in southern Israel, the single most reported casualty of the entire assault. No Israeli military personnel were killed. Iran's version of events was framed entirely differently. Iranian state media and government officials did not present the operation as a failure. They presented it as a precisely calibrated act of measured retaliation, and a message delivered, a boundary established, a signal sent. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian stated explicitly that Tehran had notified regional parties in advance, implying the operation was designed to demonstrate capability and resolve rather than to maximize casualties. Supreme Leader Khamenei's office framed the strike as a legitimate and proportionate response to Israel's attack on Iranian sovereign territory in Damascus. This is where the competing narratives diverge most sharply. Western governments in Israel characterized the assault as a reckless escalation that could have caused mass civilian casualties had the interception effort been less successful. Iran characterized it as restrained, a surgical demonstration of the Islamic Republic's ability to strike Israel directly when provoked, calibrated to avoid triggering a full-scale regional war. Both narratives contain elements of truth. The scale of the attack, in over 300 projectiles, was unambiguously designed to overwhelm rather than merely demonstrate. The advance notifications to regional parties, if accurate, suggest Tehran genuinely sought to avoid the kind of catastrophic outcome that would have made an Israeli military response politically unavoidable. The long flight time of the drones provided hours of warning, enabling near-total interception. Whether this constitutes strategic restraint or strategic miscalculation dressed up as restraint remains one of the central analytical questions of the entire episode. What is not in dispute is this: Iran fired directly at Israel. Israel's air defenses held, and both governments now face a set of choices with consequences neither can fully predict or control. When analysts and military planners assess what Iran actually achieved on the night of April 13th, they are not simply counting intercepted drones or measuring crater dimensions at Nevatim Air Base. They are asking a far more consequential question: did this attack alter the strategic balance of the Middle East? And the answer, uncomfortable as it is for those who would prefer a clean narrative, is yes, in ways that extend far beyond the physical damage inflicted. Begin with the military significance of what Iran demonstrated. For years, Western and Israeli intelligence assessments acknowledged Iranian ballistic missile capability in theoretical terms. April 13th converted theory into operational reality. Iran proved it could simultaneously coordinate a multi-vector assault across thousands of kilometers, synchronize launches from 4 separate geographic locations, and sustain a prolonged assault lasting several hours without catastrophic logistical failure. The drones, the cruise missiles, and the ballistic missiles were not fired randomly. They were sequenced, designed to arrive in waves that would progressively stress and exhaust the layers of an integrated air defense system. That level of operational coordination requires planning, discipline, and a command and control architecture more sophisticated than many Western analysts had publicly credited Iran with possessing. The Nevatim Air Base, where the single confirmed ballistic missile impact occurred, is not a peripheral installation. It is one of the most strategically significant military facilities in Israel. Nevatim is the primary base for Israel's fleet of F-35I Adder stealth fighter jets, the most advanced combat aircraft in the Israeli Air Force inventory and a cornerstone of Israel's long-range strike capability, including any potential future operation against Iranian nuclear facilities. The fact that a single Iranian ballistic missile penetrated the defensive screen and struck this specific facility was not lost on military planners on either side. It was a data point, a proof of concept, a demonstration that even the most protected installations in Israel are not entirely beyond reach. Geographically, the attack redraws the psychological map of the conflict. Israel has long operated with a degree of strategic depth, the understanding that its territory, while small, is defended by layered systems capable of neutralizing conventional threats from its immediate neighbors. The Iranian assault exposed the limits of that depth when the threat originates 1,500 kilometers away and arrives from multiple vectors simultaneously. No air defense system, regardless of its sophistication, can guarantee 100% interception against a sufficiently large and varied salvo. Iran now knows that Israel knows this. That knowledge changes calculations on both sides. For Israel, the operational implications are significant and uncomfortable. The interception success of April 13th was not achieved by Israel alone. It required the active military participation of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Jordan. American destroyers fired interceptors. British jets flew intercept missions. Jordanian air defenses engaged targets in their own airspace. This multinational response was essential to achieving the 99% interception rate that Israeli and American officials celebrated publicly. Strip away those allied contributions, and the outcome of that night looks considerably different. Israel's ability to defend itself against a full-scale Iranian missile assault without substantial allied support is now an open strategic question, and adversaries are paying close attention to that question. For Iran, the attack reshaped its deterrence posture in the region in ways that will outlast the immediate crisis. Tehran has now established publicly and undeniably that it is willing and able to strike Israeli territory directly. Every future Israeli calculation about striking Iranian assets, whether nuclear facilities, military installations, or IRGC officers, must now account for the possibility of direct Iranian retaliation at scale. That is a meaningful shift in the deterrence equation. Before April 13th, Israel could strike Iran's proxies and even Iranian personnel in third countries with a reasonable expectation that Tehran would respond indirectly. That expectation no longer holds with the same confidence. The regional strategic picture has shifted in one additional and underappreciated dimension. The Arab states whose airspace was used, and in Jordan's case, whose air defenses actively participated in protecting Israel, now face acute domestic political pressure. Jordanian public opinion is overwhelmingly sympathetic to Palestinians. The sight of Jordanian jets shooting down Iranian drones on behalf of Israel, however strategically rational from Amman's perspective, creates a domestic legitimacy problem for the Hashemite monarchy that will not disappear quickly. The same pressure applies in varying degrees across the Gulf states that tacitly supported the interception effort. Iran understands this political dynamic and will exploit it. What April 13th established in the starkest possible terms is that the shadow war between Iran and Israel is over. What replaces it, deterrence, escalation, or something more dangerous still, is the question that will define Middle Eastern security for the years ahead. In the days and weeks that followed the April 13th assault, the intelligence community, the think tank world, and the community of independent military analysts produced a body of assessment that collectively painted a picture more complex and more alarming than the initial headlines suggested. To understand where this crisis is heading, it is essential to move beyond the political statements of governments, which are invariably shaped by domestic audiences and strategic posturing, and into the analytical layer where professionals whose careers depend on being right rather than sounding reassuring do their work. The first and most significant area of analytical consensus concerns Iranian intent. Across multiple intelligence assessments and public commentary from former senior officials, a consistent picture emerges. Iran did not expect to destroy Israel on the night of April 13th. The operation was not designed for maximum lethality. It was designed for maximum messaging. Analysts at institutions tracking Iranian strategic behavior noted that the hours-long drone flight time functioned as a de-escalatory mechanism embedded within an escalatory act, giving Israel, the United States, and their partners sufficient warning to prepare defenses, thereby reducing the probability of mass casualties that would have made an Israeli military response politically and militarily unavoidable. In this reading, Iran threaded an extraordinarily narrow needle, demonstrating the willingness and capability to strike Israel directly while simultaneously limiting the physical consequences enough to preserve space for de-escalation. Not everyone in the analytical community accepts this framing. A competing assessment advanced by analysts with deep expertise in IRGC doctrine and Iranian domestic politics argues that the restrained outcome was less a deliberate design choice and more a reflection of the limitations of Iranian precision strike capability at extended range. In this view, Iran fired everything it could reasonably coordinate in a single operation and achieved approximately what its military planners realistically expected: limited penetration of Israeli air defenses, symbolic damage to a high-value target, and a propaganda victory framed around the fact of the strike rather than its physical results. The advance notifications to regional parties in this interpretation were not evidence of strategic restraint, but of Iran's need to ensure its own proxies and neighboring states were not caught off guard by an operation that could have triggered unpredictable regional responses. Intelligence assessments from Western agencies focused heavily on the performance data generated by the attack. Every intercepted missile and drone produced valuable telemetry, information about Iranian missile guidance systems, flight profiles, radar signatures, and electronic warfare capabilities that will be analyzed exhaustively by American, Israeli, and allied defense establishments for months. But the reciprocal is also true. Iranian military planners now have their own data set. They observed which projectiles were intercepted at what stage of flight, by which systems, and from which directions. They watched how the multinational coalition coordinated. They identified gaps. Every future Iranian operation will be informed by what their sensors and intelligence networks recorded on the night of April 13th. Analysts at major international security institutes drew particular attention to the ballistic missile penetration of Nevatim Air Base as the single most consequential data point of the entire engagement. The ability of even one ballistic missile to reach its target through a coordinated multilateral interception effort involving some of the most sophisticated air defense systems on the planet suggests that a larger, more sustained ballistic missile salvo, one that Iran is theoretically capable of generating, could produce significantly different results. The 99% interception rate, celebrated in public statements, was achieved against a force of approximately 120 ballistic missiles. Scale that number significantly, compress the timeline, and the mathematics of interception become considerably less favorable. Military analysts with backgrounds in American Central Command operations highlighted the extraordinary nature of the coalition that assembled to defend Israel on April 13th. The active participation of Jordan in shooting down Iranian drones was described by several former senior American military officials as a strategic development of the first order, one that reflects the deepening, if largely unpublicized, security convergence between Israel and several Arab states accelerated by the Abraham Accords and the shared perception of Iranian threat. However, the same analysts cautioned that this convergence has real political limits. Jordanian participation was defensible to Amman's domestic audience as protecting Jordanian airspace from Iranian projectiles transiting without permission. Sustained, visible military cooperation with Israel in a prolonged conflict would be an entirely different and far more politically dangerous proposition for the Hashemite government. On the question of Israeli response options, expert opinion was sharply divided along a consistent fault line. One camp argued that Israel's overwhelming strategic interest lay in accepting the diplomatic off-ramp offered by American pressure and the interception success, declaring victory, banking the international goodwill generated by the coalition defense, and avoiding escalation that could rapidly exceed anyone's ability to manage. The other camp argued that failing to impose a tangible military cost on Iran for the direct attack would permanently alter the deterrence equation in Tehran's favor, incentivizing future direct strikes and undermining the credibility of Israeli military deterrence across the entire region. What the expert community agreed on, almost universally, was this: the events of April 13th had fundamentally altered the rules of engagement in the Middle East. Whatever framework, however informal and implicit, had previously governed the shadow war between Iran and Israel was gone. Both sides were now operating in territory without established boundaries, without reliable precedent, and without a clear understanding of where the other's red lines actually lay. In the language of strategic studies, both nations had entered a period of acute uncertainty. And acute uncertainty, as history has demonstrated with painful regularity, is precisely the condition in which miscalculation becomes most likely and most dangerous. But the other side has a point. For all the gravity of what Iran did on the night of April 13th, there is a version of this story that the dominant Western narrative consistently underweights, one that does not excuse the missile barrage, but contextualizes it within a pattern of provocation, asymmetric violence, and strategic humiliation that Tehran has absorbed for years without receiving equivalent condemnation from the international community. To understand the full picture of this crisis, that version deserves serious, unsentimental engagement. Start with the Damascus consulate strike. The Israeli airstrike on April 1st destroyed a building that Iran and a significant portion of the international legal community consider sovereign Iranian diplomatic territory under the Vienna Convention. 7 Iranian military officers died. The strike was conducted without warning, without declaration, and without acknowledgement. Israel's long-standing policy of ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying responsibility for operations it conducts in third countries, means that the attack existed in a legal and diplomatic gray zone that conveniently insulated Jerusalem from formal accountability while leaving Tehran with a body count and a demolished building it was obligated by its own political logic to respond to. Iran's position, stripped of its ideological framing, is not without a recognizable logic. A sovereign state had its diplomatic facility destroyed and its senior military officers killed in what it characterized as an act of war, conducted on what it considered its own territory. The same Western governments that demanded Iranian restraint after April 13th would not, under equivalent circumstances, have counseled their own nations to absorb such a strike without response. The standard being applied to Iran, absorb the provocation, accept the asymmetry, do not escalate, is a standard that is applied selectively, and Tehran is acutely aware of that selectivity. There is also a legitimate alternative interpretation of Iranian strategic behavior that deserves more analytical airtime than it typically receives in Western commentary. The argument that Iran is an irrational, apocalyptic regime incapable of strategic calculation is contradicted by 4 decades of observable behavior. The Islamic Republic has repeatedly demonstrated the capacity for cold, patient, sophisticated strategic thinking. It built the axis of resistance over decades. It developed its nuclear program incrementally, using it as a bargaining chip rather than racing to weaponization in ways that would have triggered immediate military response. It has repeatedly pulled back from confrontations when the cost-benefit calculation turned unfavorable. The same leadership that ordered the April 13th strike has consistently chosen survival and strategic positioning over ideological maximalism when the two came into conflict. In this alternative reading, the April 13th operation was not recklessness. It was a carefully constructed act of strategic communication, one designed to establish a new deterrence baseline without triggering the full-scale war that neither Iran nor, crucially, the United States actually wants. The advanced notifications to neighboring states, the deliberate use of slow drones that provided hours of warning, the framing of the operation as concluded and non-repeating once Israel absorbed the strike without suffering mass casualties, all of these elements suggest a government attempting to manage escalation rather than ignite it. The diplomatic dimension of this alternative interpretation is equally important. In the days following the attack, Iranian officials made a series of public and back-channel communications emphasizing that Tehran considered the matter closed, that the strike was a one-time proportionate response to the Damascus consulate attack, and that Iran had no interest in further direct military engagement with Israel. These signals were largely dismissed or minimized in Western coverage focused on Israeli response options and American deterrence posturing. But several European governments and regional actors took them seriously enough to engage in quiet diplomatic activity aimed at preventing Israeli retaliation from triggering a new cycle of escalation. The counter-argument to the dominant narrative extends to the question of Israeli conduct in the months preceding April 13th. Since October 7th, Israeli military operations in Gaza had produced a death toll in the tens of thousands, the majority of whom Palestinian civilian assessments identified as non-combatants. The destruction of civilian infrastructure, hospitals, universities, residential buildings, had generated widespread international condemnation, including from governments typically aligned with Israel. The same Western nations that scrambled jets and fired interceptors to defend Israel from Iranian drones had spent months calling for humanitarian pauses and expressing concern about proportionality in Gaza. The contradiction between those positions was not lost on governments across the global South, across the Arab world, and within the domestic populations of several Western democracies. None of this makes the Iranian missile barrage defensible under international law. Firing over 300 projectiles at a civilian population center, regardless of the stated military target, carries risks of civilian casualties that no advance notification can fully mitigate, but defensible and understandable are not the same category. And a documentary that presents only the perspective of the targeted nation without seriously engaging with the strategic logic and legitimate grievances of the actor that fired is not analysis. It is advocacy. The most honest assessment of April 13th acknowledges the following simultaneously. Iran crossed a significant threshold. Iran also had reasons, grounded in observable facts, for believing it had been pushed to that threshold. The international community condemned the crossing without seriously engaging with the pushing, and a crisis that both sides had rational incentives to de-escalate was left to navigate itself through a diplomatic landscape shaped more by domestic politics and alliance obligations than by a genuine collective interest in preventing the next, potentially far more destructive exchange. Pull back from the military maps and the intercept statistics for a moment, because what happened between Iran and Israel on the night of April 13th was not merely a regional military event. It was a tremor that ran through the foundations of the global economic and geopolitical order, and the aftershocks are still moving. To understand what this crisis means for the world you live in, it is necessary to trace those tremors outward from their origin point in the skies above the Negev desert and follow them to where they land, in your energy bill, in your pension fund, in the foreign policy calculations of governments that have no direct stake in the Israeli-Iranian conflict but cannot afford to ignore it. Begin with oil. The Middle East sits atop approximately 48% of the world's proven oil reserves. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf through which approximately 20% of all globally traded oil passes every single day, is bordered on one side by Iran. Tehran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz in past confrontations and possesses the military capability to make that threat operationally credible, at least for a period of days or weeks, through a combination of mines, anti-ship missiles, and fast attack craft. Any sustained military escalation between Iran and Israel that draws American forces into direct confrontation with Iran raises the probability of a Hormuz closure scenario from theoretical to genuinely plausible. The economic consequences of even a temporary disruption to Hormuz transit would be immediate, global, and severe. Oil prices, already elevated by post-pandemic demand recovery and the supply disruptions caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, would surge. Estimates from energy market analysts suggested that a full Hormuz closure could push crude oil prices above $150 per barrel within days, a level that would translate directly into gasoline prices, transportation costs, manufacturing input costs, and ultimately consumer prices across every economy on Earth that runs on fossil fuels, which is to say every economy on Earth. The Houthi campaign against Red Sea shipping, which had already disrupted a significant portion of global container traffic before April 13th, added another layer of vulnerability to the global supply chain picture. The Red Sea and the Suez Canal together handle approximately 12% of global trade volume. Shipping companies had already been rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope to avoid Houthi missile and drone attacks, adding weeks to transit times and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel costs per voyage. Those costs were already feeding through into consumer prices for goods ranging from electronics to clothing to food. A broader regional war would accelerate and deepen that disruption substantially. For global financial markets, the psychological impact of direct Iran-Israel military confrontation was immediate. In the trading sessions following April 13th, oil prices spiked, equity markets fell, and safe haven assets, including gold and United States Treasury bonds, saw significant inflows as institutional investors repriced geopolitical risk. The market reaction reflected something that professional investors understand viscerally. The Middle East is not just a region. It is a critical node in the global economic system, and instability at that node propagates through every connected network simultaneously. The military consequences of the April 13th escalation extend well beyond the Israeli-Iranian bilateral relationship. The United States, which maintains approximately 40,000 troops across the broader Middle East region, found itself in a position it had spent years trying to avoid, actively involved in the military defense of Israel against a direct Iranian attack. American destroyers firing interceptors in the eastern Mediterranean were not conducting an exercise. They were engaged in live combat operations against Iranian projectiles. That engagement, however successful and however carefully managed to avoid direct confrontation with Iranian forces, represents a meaningful escalation in American military involvement in the regional conflict. Every Iranian-backed militia in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen observed that engagement and updated its own calculations accordingly. For NATO and the broader Western alliance architecture, the crisis exposed a tension that had been building since October 7th. European governments that had been carefully navigating between support for Israel's right to self-defense and growing public and parliamentary pressure over Gaza casualties were suddenly confronted with a direct Iranian state attack that required a response. The United Kingdom's decision to deploy Royal Air Force assets in the interception effort was militarily significant and politically consequential, committing British forces to active operations in a conflict that London had no formal treaty obligation to join. The precedent established by that decision will shape future British and European decision-making about the boundaries of their commitment to Israeli security in ways that are not yet fully understood. For China and Russia, the crisis presented a complex set of opportunities and constraints. Moscow, deeply invested in its strategic partnership with Tehran and reliant on Iranian drone technology for its operations in Ukraine, had obvious incentives to avoid actions that would further isolate or pressure Iran. Beijing, which had brokered a landmark Saudi-Iranian normalization agreement in 2023, and positioned itself as an alternative diplomatic architecture to American regional dominance, watched the April 13th events with the careful attention of a power that understood the crisis as simultaneously a threat to regional stability it depends on for energy imports and an opportunity to demonstrate the limitations of American-led security frameworks. And then there is you. If you live in the United States, Europe, or any economy integrated into global energy and trade networks, which is to say virtually everywhere, the Iran-Israel escalation is not an abstraction. It is a variable in the equation that determines what you pay to fill your car, heat your home, and buy the goods that travel on ships through the waters now patrolled by the Houthis and threatened by the prospect of Iranian anti-ship operations. It is a factor in the interest rate decisions of central banks managing inflation that has proven far more persistent than initially forecast. It is a weight on the equity markets where retirement savings are invested. It is a pressure on the defense budgets of governments that must now account for a Middle East threat environment that has permanently escalated. Resources that come from somewhere, and that somewhere is invariably the domestic budget priorities that affect public services, infrastructure, and social programs. The night of April 13th was not just Israel's problem. It became everyone's problem the moment the first drone left Iranian airspace, and the full cost of that night has not yet been calculated. In the days immediately following April 13th, the world watched two governments locked in a dangerous equilibrium, each calculating the cost of action against the cost of restraint, each aware that the next move would set a precedent with consequences neither could fully model. That equilibrium did not last indefinitely, it never does. And to understand where this crisis goes from here, it is necessary to map the decision points that will determine whether the Middle East moves toward a managed, if deeply unstable, deterrence or toward something far darker. The first and most immediate development to watch was Israel's response. American pressure, delivered with unusual directness by President Biden and senior administration officials in the hours after the attack, urged Israel to accept the interception success as a strategic victory and avoid military retaliation that could trigger a wider war. Israel's war cabinet deliberated for days. The internal divisions were real and significant, between those who argued that a failure to impose direct military cost on Iran would permanently damage Israeli deterrence, and those who recognized that the international coalition that had just defended Israel could not be taken for granted if Israel chose escalation over restraint. Israel ultimately conducted a limited, carefully calibrated strike on Iranian territory on April 19th, targeting radar systems near Isfahan, widely understood as a deliberate signal rather than a maximalist response. The strike was designed to demonstrate Israeli reach and capability without triggering the full cycle of retaliation that a larger operation would have invited. Iran's official response was notably muted, a posture that suggested Tehran was equally invested in avoiding the escalation ladder neither side could see the top of. What is confirmed from the events of April 2024 can be stated clearly. Iran launched a direct state-level military assault on Israeli territory for the first time in the history of the Islamic Republic. The assault was repelled through a multinational coalition interception effort of extraordinary coordination and effectiveness. Israel suffered minimal physical damage. Iran demonstrated a ballistic missile capability capable of penetrating sophisticated multilateral air defenses at extended range. Both nations conducted subsequent military actions that were calibrated, at least in part, to signal capability while avoiding catastrophic escalation. And the shadow war that had defined Iranian-Israeli relations for 4 decades was replaced by something new. A direct confrontation framework with no established rules, no reliable communication channels, and no institutional architecture designed to manage it. What remains uncertain is considerably more consequential than what is confirmed. The durability of Iranian restraint in the face of future Israeli strikes on IRGC assets is unknown. The threshold at which American military involvement transitions from defensive interception to active offensive operations against Iran is undefined and untested. The stability of the Arab states, whose cooperation was essential to April 13th's successful outcome, particularly Jordan, in the face of sustained domestic political pressure, is fragile and contingent. The trajectory of the Gaza conflict, which remains the single most powerful driver of regional sentiment and the proximate cause of the entire escalation sequence, is unresolved. And the question of Iranian nuclear development, accelerated in the years since the American withdrawal from the JCPOA, now potentially within months of weapons-grade enrichment capability, according to some assessments, hangs over every calculation like a shadow that grows longer with each passing month. Two scenarios now present themselves with roughly comparable analytical credibility. The first is managed deterrence, an informal, implicit understanding between Tehran and Jerusalem that direct strikes on each other's territory carry costs that neither side is prepared to bear on a sustained basis. In this scenario, both governments return to the indirect conflict framework: proxy warfare, intelligence operations, targeted assassinations, cyber attacks, while maintaining a shared interest in avoiding the direct military confrontation that risks drawing American forces into a war that could rapidly exceed anyone's ability to control. The Abraham Accords normalization architecture survives. Regional Arab states continue their quiet security cooperation with Israel. Iran continues its nuclear program under the implicit threat of Israeli military action that neither side fully wants to trigger. The Middle East remains volatile, dangerous, and deeply unstable, but short of open war. The second scenario is escalation, a sequence of action and reaction in which each side's response to the previous provocation is calibrated slightly above the threshold that triggered it, in a cycle that historical precedent suggests is extraordinarily difficult to exit once entered. A future Israeli strike kills a more senior Iranian figure than Zahedi. Iran responds with a larger, more precisely targeted missile salvo that produces significant Israeli casualties. Israel strikes Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. American forces engage Iranian naval assets. The escalation ladder, once mounted, has a momentum of its own, and the rungs at the top lead to places that no responsible government should be willing to contemplate and that no responsible analyst can afford to ignore. Which scenario prevails will be determined not by grand strategic vision, but by the accumulation of smaller decisions made under pressure with incomplete information by leaders operating within the constraints of domestic politics, alliance obligations, and the irreducible uncertainty of a crisis that has no roadmap and no referee. History suggests that in these conditions, the optimistic scenario requires sustained, active, intelligent management to materialize. The pessimistic scenario requires only a single miscalculation. The Middle East has never been short of those. What is certain is this: the world that existed before April 13th, 2024, a world in which Iran and Israel conducted their conflict through intermediaries and maintained the fiction of non-engagement, is gone. The world that replaces it is more dangerous, less predictable, and more consequential for global stability than anything the previous framework produced. The rules have changed, the boundaries have shifted. And the next chapter of this conflict will be written not in the careful language of diplomatic communiques, but in the decisions made in war rooms, intelligence briefings, and late-night phone calls between heads of state who are all, to varying degrees, trying to avoid a war they can all see approaching and none of them knows how to stop. This story is not over. It has barely begun. If you want to stay ahead of what comes next, subscribe now. Every major development in this conflict will be covered here with the same depth, the same rigor, and the same commitment to giving you the analysis that the headlines cannot. The situation is moving fast. You need to be moving with it.